Hello and welcome to a new installment of Macro 2.0, a program about big ideas, big institutions, and big money. And with me here today, as usual, is Barry Nielsen, a chartered financial analyst from Opportunity Bank. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you.
Back.
Thank you very much.
Today we're going to talk about a very large institution indeed called the Federal Reserve System. It's a complex system, otherwise known generally as the Fed. I think it's fair to say a lot of people know something about the Fed, but very few of us know very much detail about how it works, what it actually is, its major functions, and what distinguishes it from other central banks in the world economy. So we're not going to have a whole lot of time to get into much detail, but we'll talk a little bit about, first of all, what is the Federal Reserve System, and what are some of its structures. So let's start with that.
Okay. Going forward, I think I'll just refer to it mostly as the Fed, as it most often and most frequently is, as you already pointed out. The Fed is the central bank of the United States, created by an act of Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson in 1913. It has several functions and several entities within the Fed. The three primary entities being the Board of Governors, has a 7-member Board of Governors appointed by the President and or nominated by the President and confirmed by Congress, by the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
It has 12 Federal Reserve banks within the Federal Reserve System. Each of those banks has a president as elected by the Board of Governors at each one of those banks. And it has something called the Federal Open Market Committee, the FOMC, which is the part of the Fed that I believe most people are familiar with. It is the entity at the Fed, the committee that sets monetary policy, meaning the federal funds rate, which is a short-term interest rate, a short-term benchmark interest rate that plays a huge role in our economy. And so speaking of the federal funds rate and monetary policy, that is certainly one of the functions of the Federal Reserve, setting monetary policy. Another would be monitoring financial stability in the entire financial system. Another would be regulating and examining banks or responsibility for individual entity financial soundness and stability.
Yeah.
And then there's a couple other functions of the Fed, one of them being consumer education and protection and clearing financial transactions or clearing checks and the Fed wire system. And
so each of these functions is important. I'm sure the most important one, the one that affects most people and the businesses in particular, is the setting of monetary policy. So let's kind of dwell on that. We talked earlier about the sort of complicated structure of the Fed system. You mentioned the 12 reserve banks, each of which has its own Board of Governors or Board of Directors.
Yeah.
And so there are layers and layers of private individuals who have authoritative positions in each region. Each region informs the Open Market Committee because the operations of that Open Market Committee affect everybody across the nation. And I just want to get this in that even though it's our central bank, it's the main bank of the United States, it is set up on a regional basis so that the differences between different regions, information about economic conditions in different regions and different industries, get fed into the brain trust so that monetary policy is not simply a reflection of a central authority or an East Coast state of mind. And that's just a little bit about the structure and how it's regionalized. And one other thing that I don't want people...
Can I add something there real
absolutely.
quickly? So no, I think you're absolutely right. And I don't know the details of how each president of each regional Federal Reserve bank is selected. I think they're elected by the Board of Governors at each regional bank. But what we were talking about, perhaps the function, the most important function, well, I won't say the most important, but the function that most people are most familiar with, that being the monetary policy at the FOMC. That FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, consists of the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve, which again, that's a 7-member board nominated by the President, confirmed by the Senate, and then on a rotating basis, 4 presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks. So yes, each region of the country on a rotating basis has a say in monetary policy. And then it should be also said that the president of the New York Fed has a permanent spot on the FOMC. Yeah.
New York being the financial center piece of our economy, it makes a lot of sense,
Yes.
practical sense.
Yes.
The one other thing I wanted to make sure people understand is that the United States Central Bank is unusual with respect to the other central banks, most of which we're familiar with are in Europe, or China, Russia, but mostly European countries, is that it's actually a private institution that has a public charge. So there's an interlacing of public accountability, but a lot of private sector interests. And the banks are actually owned by member institutions. They member banks, and not all banks are in the Federal Reserve System. Most of them are, I think it's fair to say, and the larger ones, all of them are. But they are the shareholders in the Federal Reserve themselves. But there is an overtly public accountability, a public mission that the Fed has to meet the aggregate demands of the people of the United States. So it's a hybrid bank, and that makes it unique, I think, in the world of banking. We talked earlier also that it has 2 main functions before we get to the details of setting those short-term interest rates, between banks. And that is to check inflation and promote full employment simultaneously, which creates a very interesting dynamic balancing act. And that, too, makes it different from some other central banks. Do you want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure, I'll try. That is, again, part of the monetary policy function of the Fed that comes out of the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. What you're speaking of is known as their dual mandate. I think the actual language reads that they are mandated to maximize employment, promote stable interest rates, and moderate long-term interest rates. And we can discuss that in a little bit of a detail, but those 2 things of maximum employment and low interest rates don't always necessarily go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that the Fed does through monetary policy in trying to maximize economic growth, which maximizes employment, is they might lower short-term interest rates. The federal funds rate is the rate that they have direct control over. So if they're in a mode of raising short-term interest rates, raising the Fed funds rate, that can put a brake on the economy. That can slow lending, borrowing, risk-taking, which might slow employment growth. So it's really, and we could talk at length about this, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more in detail, but that is really a balancing act for the Federal Reserve, and therefore it's known as its dual mandate. And you mentioned the fact that the Fed's different than other central banks, other global central banks like the ECB, the European Central Bank, or the Bank of Japan, in that those central banks don't have a dual mandate. They are tasked with monitoring and stabilizing and hitting an inflation goal only. Mm-hmm. They do not have that employment mandate or that employment goal as part of their mandate. So that's another way that the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Fed, is different than other central banks.
Yeah.
And again, that dual mandate is a big topic of conversation in financial markets. Is where does the economy stand, and should the Fed be lowering rates to try to maximize employment growth and create economic growth, or are we in a point in the economy where the mission accomplished on that front, and now the Fed should be more concerned about maybe inflationary pressures, which suggests that the Fed might be in a cycle of raising short-term interest rates, and that's actually where we currently are in the U.S. in the economic cycle. And I want to make one other at the onset here. I want to make one other important point. When we talk about interest rates and monetary policy, the Federal Reserve has direct control over the Fed funds rate, which again, it's a short-term interest rate. It's the rate at which large financial institutions and banks borrow and lend to each other on an overnight basis. They are lending, again, just on a one-day basis. That's what the federal funds rate is. It's certainly correlated with other interest rates like 30-year mortgage rates, but when you see on the news the Fed raised the Fed funds rate by 25 basis points, which is 0.25%,
a quarter of a percentage point.
That does not mean that, for example, mortgage rates, which people tend to keep a close eye on, went up by an equal amount.
Yeah.
In fact, they might have gone down at the same time that the Federal Reserve raised the federal funds rate. And that's an important thing, I think, for viewers and for consumers to know, that there is a relationship between those two that we could talk about, but it's not a one-for-one lockstep relationship. Now, I know we're going to talk about this a little bit today as well, and that's some of the actions of the Fed over the past several years where they actually did target longer-term interest rates. But on an ongoing, regular basis, it's the Fed funds rate is their primary monetary tool. And
yeah. Well, before we go further along that line, one other thing that springs to mind that differentiates the Federal Reserve System from other central banks is that it is the one reason why it is a private institution with a public mandate. The idea there is to separate it and insulate it from direct political pressure so that the bank doesn't become a direct instrument of the majority power in Congress or even and the president as well. So there's a logic to that comports with our Republican structure of government. You know, we're not a pure democracy. This is just this is like the financial side of those sets of values that prevent us from being a direct democracy. Lots of people argue about whether or not the Fed should remain a private institution. They think it favors the rich, it favors large banks over small businesses. There's a lot of turmoil always going on over the proper role and identity of the Federal Reserve System. But I think one of the things most people end up understanding is that, yes, there needs to be some kind of layer insulating from these very intelligent, technocratic financial experts from the whim of members of Congress who may have an incentive to do a lot of financially irresponsible things in order to affect the level of employment or the rate of economic growth. So I wanted to plug that in there. Getting back to interest.
Let me add one more thing there,
sure
if I
thing.
may. You're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, Congress, the president, does have a big influence on the Fed because they appoint the Board of Governors of the Fed and the chairman of the Fed, who is currently Jerome Powell. But the Fed operates like any other bank. It has a balance sheet. It has a profit and loss statement. And it is self-funded in that way. So unlike other institutions of government which receive their funding through the budgetary process, the Fed operates independently. It historically has been a profit center.
Yeah, it has
and
no
so
appropriations from the Congress.
That's right.
Yeah, and also it is legally required to deposit its surplus past, there's a cap on how much it can put into its reserves. And it's billions and billions of dollars, but nevertheless, it is profitable, and those profits are deposited in the U.S. Treasury. So the United States makes money off the Fed, and that's a good thing, no doubt. You mentioned the balance sheet. You know, banks are hinge on balance sheets. So, and you mentioned earlier that the Fed, let's talk about the Fed's balance sheet. Since the 2008-2009 recession, the Federal Reserve's approach to interest rates is to keep them very, very low in order to stimulate growth, stimulate borrowing and spending, and sort of a recovery, big recovery from a very big, deep recession. In the process of keeping the system alive and ensuring sufficient liquidity in the system so that we didn't have a collapse, they engaged in something that was historically unusual called quantitative easing. I know I'm jumping ahead to this subject, but in limited time, I want to make sure we touch on it. What's quantitative easing all about, and to what end does the Fed engage in this process?
Well, I'm glad we're bringing it up now because it's hugely important. During and coming out of the great financial crisis, the Fed, in their own words, took extraordinary measures. And one of those was dropping that federal funds rate, that short-term interest rate, to zero. And again, when they do that, they try to spur borrowing and lending and economic activity and risk-taking. But again, that is a short-term interest rate. And it works well for that purpose. But taking it one step further, coming out of the great financial crisis, the Fed tried to target longer-term interest rates as well, specifically mortgage rates. At the root of the great financial crisis was a mortgage problem.
Yeah.
And to put a floor under home prices and the mortgage problem, the Fed bought over $4 trillion worth of mortgages in the form of mortgage-backed securities, mortgage bonds. Most mortgages in the U.S. get securitized and become mortgage bonds. And that created demand for mortgage bonds, which pushed mortgage rates lower. They also bought more U.S. Treasury bonds than they bought mortgage bonds. But the idea was to have the same impact, to drive longer-term interest rates, the rates at which corporations borrow and lend in the bond market, corporate bonds, to push those rates lower, and again, to create economic activity and risk-taking. And in doing so, in buying those bonds, well, the Fed controls the money supply. They literally printed money. And that was another purpose, to put money into the financial system, into the economy, again, with the purpose of stimulating economic activity in the hopes of creating lost jobs and risk-taking. You have to have risk-taking in a market economy to create growth and jobs. And so on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet for the past 10 years, in some amount approaching, there's been $4 trillion worth of U.S. Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Now, that was not supposed to be a permanent thing, and now we've entered a phase where the Federal Reserve is allowing those bonds, as bonds do, to pay off and for the balance sheet to shrink. And as such, the money supply is shrinking as well.
Yeah.
So that was, again, the Fed itself called it extraordinary measures to try to stimulate growth following the great financial crisis.
Yeah. You know, another aspect of that crisis, we touched on it last time we were talking about the dollar as the international currency, the current reserve currency of the world. You mentioned the $4 trillion of acquisitions that the Fed made of Treasury bonds and other bonds. It also engaged in currency swaps with foreign central governments to keep the liquidity alive and well in the global financial system. So our Fed is in effect, it's been characterized as the liquidity provider of last resort in the global banking system, that the stability of international transactions, generally speaking, rests not solely, but hugely on the shoulders of this American institution, an American private banking system that's connected to the U.S. government, but in unique ways.
Yeah, the world runs on used dollars. As we talked about, I think it's over 70% of global trade takes place, is transacted in U.S. dollars. Other global central banks hold U.S. dollars on their balance sheets. The world needs dollars, and yeah, as you just mentioned, dollar swaps as were part of the Fed's response to the great financial crisis to keep liquidity in the global financial system.
Yeah. Well, as usual, we've exhausted our time before we've exhausted our willingness to talk about big ideas and big institutions. You mentioned, and we should rest on the fact that the Fed has this dual charge to, charge against inflationary pressure and in promotion of economic growth. Next time we get together, we're going to kind of dwell on inflation, what it is, what causes it, how it affects our lives. So thanks, Barry Nielsen, for being with us, and thank you for watching Macro 2.0. Please join us next time.